Hello, Minnesota historians. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the gangster era of Minnesota. A lot of times you probably don't really associate the gangster era with our state, but we did really have a lot of gangster stuff going on here during the Prohibition era of the 1920s. I think most of the time when you think gangsters and Prohibition, it tends to gravitate towards Chicago because that's where you had Al Capone and lots of things going on there. But Al Capone was doing things in Minnesota. He had contracts with people making moonshine, and then just kind of hanging out in different parts up north or in St. Paul. And we'll talk a little bit about St. Paul as well and its connection to the gangster era of the 1920s. We know with Prohibition, one of the ideas with it was that by outlawing alcohol, you would also probably get rid of a lot of problems, domestic violence, and things like that. However, what we saw when we banned alcohol was an increase in mob activity, mafia, gangs, and all that stuff that goes along with it, and it became very violent. So the city of St. Paul in the early 1900s became a safe haven for gangsters, and it's because of the O'Connor layover agreement. John O'Connor was a chief of police around 1900, and he decided, I don't want any violent crime in my city. So he allowed criminals to stay in the city under three conditions. One, when they first arrived in St. Paul, or if they were going to be living there, they needed to check in with police. The second thing that they needed to do was pay bribes to city officials. And then the third thing they needed to do was promise not to kill, kidnap, or rob within the city limits. So this was basically an agreement that they would not commit any violent crimes in the city. So St. Paul actually had very low violent crime rate compared to other cities at the time. And so the police chief, the judges, higher ups in the government were all getting paid bribes by these criminals that would arrive and just kind of hang out in St. Paul, and they didn't need to worry about being arrested. Now, at the time, jurisdiction of who could go and arrest people kind of ended at the borders. So if you were in Iowa and they were chasing you, once you got to Minnesota, you were pretty much safe until you committed a crime in Minnesota. Same thing, if you're in Minneapolis and you commit a crime and then you go to St. Paul, the Minneapolis police aren't going to track you there. In the early 1930s, they're going to actually create the FBI. And the FBI is the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and they are the ones that are going to now cross state lines and try to track people down. This was our big mob boss in St. Paul. His name was Dan Hogan. They called him Dapper Dan Hogan. And he basically was kind of the go-between between the police and the visiting mobsters. He would take, set up a meeting. He might take the bribes and give them to the police and basically say, hey, they're here, just so you know, and here's their bribe. He owned the Green Lantern Hotel and Saloon, which was a very popular hangout for gangsters throughout the early 1900s. They could go there and gamble and socialize. He had slot machines in there that they could play the slots and other things that were perfectly legal back in those days. This is in the early 1930s, they'll outlaw the slot machines and confiscate them. Green Lantern would have been one of those speakeasies during the 1920s with the secret doors and the hideaways and that type of stuff. Now, Dapper Dan, like many mobsters, comes to an unfortunate end. In 1928, his car blew up. This is the same model car that he would have been in. And it was one of the first known car bomb attacks in the country. And it was actually a pretty big mystery as to what happened. He really didn't have any enemies because people on both, he worked for people on both sides and was a good go-between. And they think probably his number two in command, who wanted to be number one in command, probably is the guy that set the bomb off. And it was this guy, Geo Stubblefield. Another famous hangout was Nita Clifford's brothel in St. Paul. It was a popular hangout for gangsters. The brothel bribed police for over 30 years to stay open. And Breezy Point Lodge, some of you have been there and stayed up at Breezy Point, up by Brainerd. It was created in 1921, and it was a destination for the rich and famous. There was illegal alcohol being sold there in the summer months. Jazz musicians from all over the country would show up and play there, and so people would go up there and hang out, and it was kind of a hideout spot. It wasn't safe like St. Paul, but for the most part, nobody messed with Breezy Point. Al Capone would come to Minnesota. He would hang out in St. Paul. He had some spots in northern Minnesota that he would go to. And a lot of the illegal whiskey that was being shipped into Chicago was actually coming from Minnesota, and it was coming from Stearns County. I think we watched that little video on Stearns County 13 where they were growing that corn, Minnesota 13 corn, turning it into moonshine or whiskey, and shipping it down to Capone in Chicago where he would sell it. Now, when Prohibition comes to an end, a lot of the criminals still need money. How are they going to get this money if they are no longer able to sell illegal alcohol because it's now legal? Well, they turn to bank robbing and kidnapping. And so we start to see some of these famous bank robbers show up in Minnesota as well when it gets too hot where they're at. Babyface Nelson was one of these guys that would rob banks around the country, including he robbed banks in Minnesota, in Brainerd and Grand Rapids, and he would go and hang out in St. Paul where they knew Babyface Nelson was at. But they didn't mess with him. The cops left him alone because he bribed them. Machine Gun Kelly, not the rapper, was from Tennessee, but he also would come up and use St. Paul as a hideout. And then maybe the most famous gangster of them all, the most famous bank robber of them all, John Dillinger. He also hid out in St. Paul. And at one point, the FBI came and tracked him down, and he had a shootout with them in St. Paul. He was living with his girlfriend, Billy Frechette. And so he was robbing banks all over the place. And he escapes St. Paul and hides out in Wisconsin. Here's some information from the Midwest crime wave, where Dillinger was robbing a bunch of places. Here you can see machine guns blaze as jury whitewashes police. There was a trial where a jury was deliberating over whether our St. Paul police and courts were taking bribes and were guilty of that type of stuff. And the jury said, nope, they're innocent. And on the same day that they find that police force innocent, there's the shootout with John Dillinger. A few months later, Dillinger is killed, and he's shot in Chicago by a Texas Ranger working for the FBI. He didn't say freeze. He didn't say put your hands up. He just walked up and shot him and said that's how you put an end to these guys. Good movie, Dillinger, starring Mark Harmon. Watch it. There was also one with Dillinger starring, what's his name? Johnny Depp that you could watch called Public Enemy. Another famous gang, the Ma Barker gang. Also, Elvin Creepy Karpus was part of that gang. And so they were hiding out in St. Paul. And just like there's not supposed to be any violent crime, but Dillinger has a shootout. And then the Ma Barker gang, here's Ma Barker and her kids, Doc Barker and Fred Barker. They actually kidnapped two very famous wealthy people. They kidnapped William Ham Jr., who was one of the owners of the Ham Beer Company. And they kidnapped Edward Bremer, who is one of the owners of Bremer Bank, if you've heard of those. And so when they kidnapped Bremer, they asked for $200,000, and when they kidnapped Ham, they asked for $100,000. Americans were fascinated with criminals and their ability to escape. You had these dime novels being written, these cheap books kind of turning the gangsters and the bank robbers into heroes. And that's where the FBI is formed, and they now say, okay, we can cross state lines and go get these guys. Ma Barker and her son Fred were killed in a shootout with the FBI in Florida. They brought Doc Barker back, and he had to go on trial for the kidnapping of Edward Bremer. Alvin Creepy Karpus was captured and sentenced to, in St. Paul, he was sentenced to life in Alcatraz. He gets out when he's an old guy, and all the money that he had put in the bank just kept gaining interest, so he was really rich. By 1935, people in St. Paul basically are now reading newspaper articles about how the O'Connor layover has been protecting these criminals, and that ends. A lot of St. Paul officials, detectives, and police officers are forced to resign or are arrested. And that's basically the end of the gangster era, but it lasts until 1935 in St. Paul, and that brought all these very famous people up here. I'll have a link that you can watch that'll show you some of these cool places where they were at.